forward clutch. Now that's a nice air check of both of these drums. So why bother to air check? What this tells me is that my sealing rings are working correctly, the new ones I put in. The surfaces where the rings ride are okay, and I did a good job on the inspection. The check balls in the drum and the piston are both working fine. Also, the lip seals I installed were installed correctly. This can save me a big headache before I install the transmission in the vehicle. Next, I'll reinstall my output shaft support into the case. This requires 4 bolts 1 inch long, and these should be torqued to 150 inch-pounds. Next, I'll reinstall my governor with both valves on the output shaft. And I want to make sure to line up the hole for the pin, and then reinstall the pin with the clips. Next, reinstall the thin snap ring that holds our governor on, the thick one at the bottom of the bearing, if you have a bearing there, and notice which way this bearing goes on with the groove facing down, and the thick one on top of that bearing. Now we're ready to install our servos into the case. Now I'd like to show you a couple different gear variations. On the second gear servo, you could have an early one, and we haven't shown this one. It's just a cover, a spring, and a rod. It's a very simple setup. Now you don't want to interchange these servos because they are matched to your valve body. There's also an early reverse piston. And the breakdown looks like this. There's a small snap ring holding the top on, and then a spring inside it. Again, these are not interchangeable. On the reverse servo, lube the bore and the seal as always. Reinstall the piston, the spring, and the retainer. Now this spring is usually light enough, you can just use your thumb, push down, and reinstall that snap ring. On our second gear servo, it starts the same way. Drop the piston in. This will take a little work because it does have the steel rings. But do this gently. Never force this piston into the bore. When you have it centered, wiggle around till it goes to the bottom of that bore. Installing the top on this servo is a little more difficult because the spring is so strong. I like to use a pair of vice grips, one like this with a big C channel. I'll get on one side of the case here, and I'll just help it. I don't want to force it, I just want to help it down. When the piston's safely lower than the snap ring groove, I'll lock the pliers into place and then reinstall the snap ring. I'll be careful because these pliers can come off here. As I reinstall my reverse band, I want to make sure I rotate it until it securely fits onto the lug here. Now I'm ready to reinstall the band strut, and I'll just slide it back down in there, and with the adjuster out of the way, I should be able to put that in with my fingers. You can check your installation by lifting up on the apply arm and just watching the band. Next, I want to just start the adjuster screw in the hole here. Now I've applied petroleum jelly on the bushing surface of my reverse drum, and I'll go ahead and install it. When it's seated in there correctly, it only spins one direction, and the front of the drum here is about even with my output shaft support. Next, I'll lubricate my output shaft well and the rings on it, and then I'll install it in the back of the case. Then again, my rear ring gear and the thrust washer I'll hold in place with plenty of petroleum jelly, as with the rest of the thrust washers. Next is my rear planet carrier and the thrust washer. Now the sun gear and the shell with its thrust washer. For our front planet carrier and ring gear, don't forget the thrust washer here, but I want to put these two items together before I slide it down the output shaft. because we're engaging into the gear and the shaft at the same time, you have to rotate these pieces to get it to drop in where it belongs. And next, I'll reinstall the snap ring on the output shaft. On our tail housing, we've cleaned off all the old gaskets and installed the new rear seal. With the new gasket installed and lined up correctly, it's time to reinstall my tail housing. And again, I'll need my snap ring pliers to hold that snap ring open as I drop this down. Now you will notice as you set that down, the snap ring doesn't quite go into the snap ring groove. You'll have to use a screwdriver and lift up on the output shaft until it snaps into place. Then install the new gasket, the plates, and the screws. And be sure to tighten these as tight as you can by hand. You'll have 6 tail housing bolts, 1 1/8 inch long. Be sure to torque these to 25 foot-pounds. Our particular model uses a steel washer on the output shaft here. Not all units will use this, and if you need additional shims for the end play, you can always add one. Next, I'll install my forward and direct clutch drums. And to do this, I'll have to spin these around until the clutches engage. Notice how far the direct clutch drum sits inside our sun gear shell when it's properly installed. Now, if any time I want to check to make sure all my clutches are engaged, I just push down on the direct clutch drum and make sure I can still spin the forward clutch drum both ways. This ensures me that it's installed all the way. I'll install my pump gasket and my front pump. Now I've left out the second gear band and no O-ring on the pump at all. And I want to install this all the way in, and I want to make sure to line up my bolt holes and then start 2 bolts, one across from each other, and I'll tighten these down with just a speed wrench. Now if both my drums are still in place, as soon as I feel these bolts snug up at all, I want to make sure the input shaft still turns freely. And if it does, then I know it's assembled correctly, and I'll go ahead and tighten these up fairly snug. Now what we want to check is total unit end play. That's how much the pieces inside this transmission can shift from end to end inside the transmission. Now I want to push the input shaft all the way back. I'll use a pair of vice grip pliers, or you could use a dial indicator, but this is a nice simple way to do it. I want to make sure these are a nice pair of pliers with a good side to them. Now push that up as tight as I can to the stator itself. Also make sure the input shaft's all the way back. Now once it's clamped on there, I'll pull it out. Then using my feeler gauge again, I want to measure how much room there is between the stator and my pliers. This figure will be our end play, and we must keep this between 20 to 50 thousandths. And remember, this is adjusted by using different thickness washers behind the pump and in between the forward and direct clutch drum. Now when I'm satisfied with the end play, I'll remove the pump and install my second gear band. Next, I'll reinstall the pump gasket and put the square cut seal on the outside pump. I want to make sure that I lubricate both the seal and the bore that the pump fits into. And I'll reinstall my pump. And be sure to check this the same way we did when checking end play. Just use 2 bolts to snug them down, make sure we can still turn that input shaft. Don't forget to put the new washers from your kit on the pump bolts. And torque all these bolts to 175 inch-pounds. Now I've reinstalled my band adjusting screw. And notice on the second gear bands, some of these are notched only on one side, so they'll only fit in that case one way. And here's a look at my struts reinstalled and my accumulator and spring. Be sure to use plenty of petroleum jelly on this piece. For our reverse band adjustment, I want to make sure the band moves freely on the drum and it's centered. Then I'll tighten the screw down by hand until I find the movement of that arm is only 3/8 of an inch when I pry on the arm with a screwdriver. Then I want to tighten that lock nut. And finally, make sure the adjustment isn't too tight by turning the output shaft and making sure the reverse drum still turns. Second gear band adjustment starts with reading the ratio on the band apply arm. Ours is a 2.9. With the lock nut backed off, I want to use a short wrench and just snug this band adjustment. Now if I have a ratio of 4.0 or less, I want to back this off 2.5 times. If it's more than 4.0, I want to back it off 2.25 times. And then tighten down the lock nut securely. Now I've reinstalled the neutral safety switch and I'm ready for my valve body. Be sure to lubricate the shaft that goes through the seal. And now we'll have to install the park rod down into the linkage hole there. And I want to start the shaft through the hole in the case. Now I'll have to turn the output shaft in order to get the park linkage to drop in. Once it does, I can push the valve body down into place. The valve body bolts are 1.1 inch long and need to be torqued to 100 inch-pounds. Now I have 3 screws with the larger washers that held my filter on. And again, I'll just want to hand tighten these 3 screws. Now before you install your pan, you'll want to make sure that it's nice and straight. Usually they're dimpled out from over-tightening at all the bolt hole locations. So take a hammer on a steel bench and tap these holes back. Make sure they're nice and flat, just like you would any valve cover. Our converter installation starts by lubricating the hub well and the front pump seal. I want to highly recommend replacing your torque converter with a rebuilt unit. After all, these are a sealed unit. I can't see what's going on inside or how much debris is still in the converter itself. With the rebuilt converter, I'll also get a new hub to make sure my bushing and seal surface are adequate. Without a doubt, the Chrysler torque converter is probably one of the hardest to install, so it definitely takes some patience. Guide it into the front bushing, lift up on the converter, jiggle around and slowly spin. Now keep wiggling this converter until it drops all the way back in. If it's not working, pull it back out and try it again. There are 2 methods that I use to make sure this converter is in all the way. One is to listen to the pump gears as I turn the converter. You can hear them knocking. And the other is to take a measurement using a straight edge across the bell housing and see what the depth on these pads are. On this one, it's about 5/8 of an inch. I can go to the back of my engine block and compare that measurement, measuring from the flex plate to the back of the engine block. And when I have the transmission tightly bolted to the engine, I should be able to spin that converter freely. There should be about an 1/8 inch between the pad and the flex plate if this converter is pushed back into the transmission properly. Another thing I'd like to mention is some of these converters have weights on them, and these are matched to the engine size. So be careful not to mismatch the converter with the engine size, or you'll get a vibration you just won't forget. Now before you reinstall the transmission in the vehicle, remember the cooler lines that hooked onto the transmission here and at the back here? These need to be flushed out and cleaned from debris. Use a can of carburetor cleaner and spray as much as you can, about 1/2 can, and then blow it out with the air nozzle. And repeat this process, alternating some carb cleaner and then blow it dry with air, and keep doing this until the lines flush clean. After your transmission's back in the vehicle, there's one adjustment you may want to do or may have to do. and that is dealing with the small TV linkage here. There's an arm that comes off this and a cable or rod that goes all the way to your carburetor, and these are always adjustable. Checking it at wide open throttle, if we adjust this so it pushes back on this arm farther, our shifts will be later and harder. If we adjust it so it pushes less on this arm, our shifts will be earlier and softer. I like to adjust this for most street vehicles so that I'm done shifting into third gear by 30 miles an hour. Now when it comes to filling the transmission, you want to put 4 quarts in, have someone start it up, add another 4 right away, and then start checking the stick. I want to thank you for being with us, and should you have any questions or comments about our tapes, be sure to drop us a line at this address.